Damien Alexander, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and present to you on the Australian meat industry. And if you didn't notice by my accent already, I'm obviously from Australia. I'm going to talk about food safety best practices. We're going to touch it. We've got 30 minutes, so I'm going to work through from paddock to plate, and there's quite a lot. You could spend multiple days on this topic. So I'm going to touch on some high-level things in the food safety space, particularly based around my experience of working across the industry. I am the SQF representative for Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. I'm also the founder of Food Network Solutions. So we're a training organisation, food safety training organisation. It's actually over 30 years experience working in the food industry, working from seafood, meat, poultry, dairy, from an industry perspective. Likewise, I've worked as an auditor. I've been a registered auditor now, master auditor with Exemplar Global, 25 years auditing. And I've trained, I'm coming up to close to 10,000 people in the food industry around food safety, different types of food safety topics such as HACCP and so on and so forth. So lots of industry experience and lots of passion for the food industry. So before I talk about best practice for the meat industry and again, from paddock to plate in Australia, I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of the breakup of how where the Australian meat industry stands, not only for Australia, but in the world as well. So the Australian meat industry is incredibly important to the Australian economy. It's the we're the second largest commodity. The meat is the second largest commodity to export in Australia, behind mining and minerals. And the majority of certainly red meat, which is our largest food product export commodity, 70% of red meat grown, produced in Australia is actually exported. 50% of lamb is exported. The rest, I should say, is consumed domestically. Around 10%, 5 to 10% of poultry is exported, and pork, it's around about 30%. Now, those percentages do fluctuate depending on climatic conditions and market conditions. But as I mentioned, it's an incredibly important industry for the Australian economy. It employs around about 500,000 people, and it is continuing to grow. As I might say is, particularly in Australia, the consumption of meat, particularly poultry, but red meat also, is continuing to grow as well. So just to break down that again, so out of all of our different meat commodities, majority, 70% of it is beef, again, 40 to 45%. And this is lamb. We have mutton, poultry, and then other meats such as pork and goat. So I'm going to touch on, from a food safety perspective, the meat industry, I'm going to touch across all of those. We'll dig into some of them a little bit deeper, but as I mentioned, really significant industry for Australia. As a result of the industry being so significant for the welfare of our country, and as a commodity, it's actually quite heavily regulated as well. So not quite from paddock to plate, but across lots of different processing sectors, there is legislated criteria that our industry must meet, not only to produce domestically, but for exporting as well. This graph here gives you an indication of the volume, but I particularly wanted to highlight this because, as you may or may not know, Australia is the driest continent in the world. And we do happen to have some significant droughts that happen. Generally, every 20 years, we have a fairly significant drought. And Australia being so big, it depends on the region. We could have a flood in one side of the country and significant droughts on the other side of the country. Certainly around 2020, heading into 2021, we had some significant droughts, and that actually impacted on the volume of goods produced, meat products produced. And likewise, a number of, and I actually live in Armidale, which is regional New South Wales, which is cattle country, for an area where there's quite a lot of domestic cattle grown. And a lot of farmers, the drought was so significant that a lot of farmers actually had to destroy what they had left or sell off what they had left. And the ones that actually survived and continue to go through have successfully been really successful. And that's not uncommon with Australia, where it's feast or famine in the farming industry, and it can be very challenging. With our number one export, which is as recent as September, it was Japan, but it's now USA. Likewise, we export to China and South Korea. Lamb, Middle East and Europe, we have been doing live animal exports, but that now is coming to an end. Mutton to China and the Middle East, poultry to Japan, China and Asia, and then pork, veal and goat products to Asia, Japan, China and including Africa as well. And again, get an idea of the cattle numbers. There's a roundabout from a beef perspective. We got down to around 15 million head during the drought. But we're now, actually that's 2022, but we're now sitting at around 25 million head. So our numbers do fluctuate very much on the climatic conditions. So from a food safety perspective and best practice, again, from paddock to plate, it absolutely starts at the paddock. It starts with animal feed. The environment in which the animals are grown and live and breed, etc., can have a significant impact on what the consumer consumes from a food safety perspective. So from a feed perspective, and we can break it down into two types: from a feedlot, from a pork and beef, and likewise to a lesser extent poultry, to likewise open paddock and green fields. Heavy metals, lead, arsenic, cadmium, they don't break down. They're forever chemicals. What happens is they tend to leach and dissipate into the soil further. However, if consumed or absorbed by the animals, that can continue on through the food chain. And likewise, organochlorides, pesticides, they can spend decades in the soil. And we've had ones that were previously used in Australia, which subsequently been banned, can still be in the soil to this day. So if you're a farmer on the land, how you control your cattle or your livestock is going to be really important, and knowing the land and knowing what's been on there previously. So where rubbish has been dumped, or previous rubbish tips, garbage tips, chemical storage areas, previous uses for grazing land, what they've been used for. And again, can be a challenge in a drought where farmers may have to migrate their cattle from fairly significant distances to keep their feed going. Knowing what the land, the feed itself, is really, really important from a food safety perspective. So segregation of cattle from certain areas, application of agricultural chemicals, for example, how they're applied and where they're applied for toxic weeds, to eradicate those, and making sure that there's no chemical residues that end up in the feed. Veterinarial chemicals as well, including antimicrobials or for parasites. One thing that we do have in Australia is any veterinary chemicals applied to animals need to be applied by a qualified vet, a qualified and registered veterinarian. So that's very heavily regulated. So again, ensuring, and it's not just the manufacturing, which is when people think about meat industry or food manufacturing and food safety, it actually absolutely starts in what's being ingested by the animals. And that can carry through and have an implication to food safety perspective. Likewise, for feed that's being produced, we do have a number of regulatory requirements that businesses need to meet regarding feed, and likewise testing that is associated with that to make sure that there's no MRL, so there's meeting maximum residue limits, chemical residues, heavy metals, etc. is not carrying through. This was a photo, and again, where I live. I was actually out for a drive yesterday to go see a client, and this is actually a photo of cattle literally on the side of the road. One of the things that we have had for a number of years in Australia, which is absolutely considered best practices, we have very strong traceability. And again, all the way through from paddock to plate. This ties in with biosecurity controls, food safety controls, and product integrity to ensure that if the product is being sold as grass-fed or whatever claims that are being made, we can actually validate that and substantiate that. So that absolutely starts, and you can see the ear tag there on the beast. That ear tag has the details of the owner and the area in which that, so the farm in which that beast has been grown or grazing, and then that'll go through to the abattoir where that information is captured. And again, the traceability continues on through there. So traceability is incredibly important to ensure the integrity of the meat and the industry, particularly from an export perspective, but also from a food safety perspective. If there is an issue, then it can be traced back to what was actually the root cause of that problem. So continuing on, spoke about on-farm, again, high level on-farm, but then prior to slaughter, the hygiene of the animals is incredibly important. So the cleanliness of the animals prior to slaughter is something that all abattoirs are keenly aware of, and they can either reject cattle, but also there is washing processes that can be put in place. And again, the environment in which they are transported or held prior to going into slaughter is really important, particularly if you've had lots of wet weather or flooding and their location. This is obviously a heavily contaminated beast. This is what we call DAGs. And the importance of making sure that the cleanliness of the beast is we don't want to introduce pathogens of concern, so E. coli, salmonella, listeria, so forth. So before that cattle or animal goes through to slaughter, the cleanliness of the animal is critically important. And it's the same with all this goes across. I mentioned about poultry and pork, etc. The same principles apply to reduce that level of contamination coming into the slaughterhouse or the abattoir. Really important. And so generally there is an inspection process prior to slaughter to make sure that that's okay. Once we get into the slaughter process, the slaughter practices, again, the facilities and equipment, not just making sure that they are clean and maintained in a hygienic condition, but it's actually set up appropriately to ensure that the flow of the process through that slaughtering process cannot introduce some potential cross-contamination. So to give you an example, with again, beef, when the removal of the hides of the beef, when it's removed, you need to make sure that the outside of the hide is not touching the meat, because the outside of the hide will naturally have some higher levels of potential pathogens, or certainly micro load, that are on there. So ensure that the facilities equipment are set up so that can be done appropriately. Double knife rotation is, and sometimes you see 3 knife rotation is best practice, where what they're doing is where they actually will do a cut and then they'll put their knife into a disinfectant sanitizer hot water bath, and then go to the next knife, and then likewise. So they're continually rotating knives to ensure that they're not spreading any pathogens of concern into and across the meat. Likewise, too, from a poultry perspective, the handling of the meat, how that's handled, how that is actually hung, how the birds are hung prior to slaughter, so they'll get hung upside down prior to them actually being slaughtered, is really critical. And you may have seen poultry where, particularly around and the leg and the thighs of the poultry, that looks quite red inside, and automatically you think, well, that would indicate that the meat is not cooked properly. What's often the case is if they're not handled correctly, if they are handled roughly and hung prior to slaughter incorrectly, then what will happen, there'll be a burst of blood vessels, and you can cook the poultry, you can cook it, but those blood vessels will actually stain the meat. And what will appear to be uncooked poultry is actually not, it's fully cooked. So that's probably more of a quality perspective more than a food safety perspective, but the handling, the environment, the conditions, and ensuring that segregation of the contaminated hides, or for poultry, for pork, for example, the throat and the snout, and likewise the intestines, the intestinal tract, which will naturally have high levels of microload, how they are removed, ensuring that they're not opened up to spread the bacteria, and the segregation of that process. One of the things that we do have, again, that is critical in Australia is pre-inspection before slaughter and post-inspection prior to slaughter. They have to be done by qualified, trained individuals to ensure that once the animal has been slaughtered, that there is no signs of contamination on there. Likewise, in the beef industry, there is micro testing, and for other industries as well, meat industries as well, there is micro testing that occurs. And in the beef industry, there's national reporting requirements where the levels, for example, of E. coli is tracked and trended to ensure that we're not increasing the pathogens aren't increasing, that we're maintaining it and keeping it under control. Likewise, chilling. So after the slaughtering process, the chilling of the animals is critical. Now, from a food safety perspective, chilling of meat as quick as possible is fantastic to ensure that there's no opportunity for pathogen growth or spoilage, microorganism growth. The challenge you have with that is if you chill red meat particularly very quickly, the meat can become very tough, can become very hard. So we do have some we do have some chilling requirements that the animals need to be met across all the different types of meat products, to ensure that you're maintaining that quality, but also ensuring that pathogen growth is not continuing to occur. This is an example, and I should make a call out to a company called Bindery Beef, who was actually the people I was visiting yesterday. They were kindly enough to provide me some examples, and this is some quality testing and different types of inspections that are occurring on the beef post-slaughter, generally down into the deboning stage, to ensure that the quality of the beef and the grading of the beef is appropriate. Post-slaughter, from a poultry perspective, we use in Australia generally what are called spin chillers. So this is an example. This is not one in a factory. This is a piece of equipment outside of a factory to be introduced into a factory. What happens is the slaughtered bird goes into it's an ice water bath at one end of it, and there's a big corkscrew that spins it across, and this is a way of chilling the bird down. The water is chlorinated, so they generally use a chlorinated solution or a peracetic acid, but in the most instances, a chlorinated solution to prevent the microgrowth, and often, if done correctly, you can get a 1 to 2 log reduction in microorganisms as part of that process. And that is commonly used. We do have air chilling that is used. It's commonly used in Europe, but is used in Australia. No water involved, going through to a blast chiller as part of that. Again, some quality benefits as associated with that, can be more expensive. But one of the key things, like with any chlorinated wash water, when you're washing food products, that the critical criteria is the free available chlorine. So not just testing chlorine levels, but in testing your actual free available chlorine, because your chlorine levels can be quite high, but if the water has lots of contaminants inside of it, they can absorb that chlorine and take away the free available chlorine that actually does the sanitization effect. And likewise associated with that is the pH, because your chlorine levels, or your free available chlorine, is impacted by the acidity or alkalinity of the water. So if it's too acidic, and again, depending on where the water is sourced from, if it's too acidic, then you can be adding as much chlorine as you like. The actual sanitizing process with the chlorine won't actually work. So really critical to maintain and monitor free available chlorine and the pH as part of that for that process. Continuing on, personal hygiene, and I know I'm talking about best practice, but when it comes to best practice, you cannot get away from some of the basics, because your personal hygiene, and I'm going to talk about food safety culture very briefly coming up, and this is an example in a post slaughter. This is a deboning and boning room operation, of example of personal hygiene that would be worn in that type of operation. You'll find that post-slaughter for the meat industry is a combination of automation and manual handling. Still lots of manual handling in the meat industry, across all of the industry. Probably less so in the poultry industry now than the red meat industry, but still really important. So from a best practice perspective, process flow, condition of equipment, cleaning, sanitization of the environment, the equipment that surrounds, and likewise personal hygiene, really critical to maintain, to ensure that that's being conducted appropriately. Likewise, the introduction of foreign objects. So to potentially with this blade that's using to cut through bone, etc. This would be a flat blade, but blade chips, and certainly when you get into further processing of mince and so forth, the potential to introduce foreign objects from equipment is critical. So best practice is, and it can be done multiple times a day, but often done once a day, is pre-hygiene inspections, but actually going through and looking at the condition of the equipment with a torch, checking for condition of welds, blades, any metal on metal wear. And by narrowing and using a torch to do that, zeroes your focus in, so you can actually look and work your way through it. So from a preventative perspective, to make sure that equipment is being maintained appropriately. Again, example of this is pork products, a combination of automation and manual handling. Still lots of manual handling involved, people involved. And likewise process flow. So what's going in and what's going out, and then where there is waste, how that waste is then removed and not then being reintroduced to contaminate, or rework being reintroduced to contaminate products. Really common, and I get asked this a lot from an industry perspective, is the training around particularly maintenance people and their implication from a food safety perspective, but that personal hygiene and criteria for visitors, contractors, maintenance, really critical. Foreign object detection. So generally there's two types that are used in the industry in Australia, and yes, they've been around for some time. There is some other technology out there, such as microwave technology, which has been used in the infant formula for a number of years. But the generally two that are used is the one on the right-hand side. There is an example of X-ray technology for bones and bone chips, where it's looking at the different densities to actually highlight that and pick that up. And then metal detectors, been around for a long time. The technology has improved, particularly where they're shielded from other electromagnetic fields that may surround it too. And ensuring the least sensitive part of a metal detector to pick up the different types of metals is actually right in the center of the aperture. right in the middle of the aperture, and a number of standards or customer requirements will say test at the bottom or the top and so forth. But right in the dead center of the aperture is the weakest or the least sensitive part of that electromagnetic field with the metal detector. So I will often encourage that, yes, they can meet the customer requirements by all means, but checking with your stainless, ferrous and non-ferrous test pieces to ensure that we're picking up those through the center. And likewise, ensuring from a best practice perspective that your types of stainless that you're actually testing for with your metal detectors, the different types of stainless steel, 316, etc., your test pieces also reflect the types of metal or stainless that are commonly used in the facilities, particularly where there is metal on metal wear or high potential points of contamination. Are we actually testing for the right types of stainless steel as part of that? Following through to packaging, again, food additives that are used. I'm not going to touch on different types of small goods production and ready-to-eat meats because I could spend, 2 days on that. But continuing through for different types of processing food additives, processing aids, machine greases, oils, lubricants that could come in and contaminate the food products as well, and chemicals that might migrate from packaging. The example on the right-hand side there is another example of automation where the meat is actually being packed in into crates as part of their process. So micro testing is done extensively with the meat industry in Australia. It is regulated, particularly for export, because we need to provide that as part of particularly exporting to our main countries of export, so America, Japan, China, etc. But we do it for our domestic markets as well. And your main pathogen, again, from a red meat perspective, we do testing for total plate count, E. coli, salmonella testing, staphylococcus, so on and so forth, listeria for ready-to-eat foods. And again, it's going to depend on the product, the process, and the risk, but they're the common ones that are certainly required. I wanted to show this example as well. So this is we have 3 big retailers in Australia that actually sell the majority of our meat domestically through Woolworths, Coles, and Aldi supermarkets. And so this is an example where meat is actually processed, put into trays, and then they're delivered to the supermarket. In this case, this is Woolworths, where they arrive in trays and then they're fed directly onto the shelf, or the product's removed from the trays and put straight into a case, such as this, where it is sold as you can see there, unpackaged. We do have some low levels of manufacturing at the supermarket level, but generally that's done at the processing level, gets to the store, the supermarket, and then unwrapped or displayed on the shelf as such, as you can see there. So, conscious of time, best practice. It would be remiss of me not to talk about management commitment. Now, as mentioned earlier, I work for SQF as their representative and have a long history of working with SQF since its inception in Australia. And the number one clause with GFSI standards, but particularly with SQF, is management commitment. And the reason why it's number one is because it's critically important. Those, while the technical aspects of the meat industry is really important, those soft skills or that commitment to ensure that with the business is resourced appropriately to that food safety. It's not just about sales. It's not just about the next market and who else we can make more profit from. It's actually a commitment to ensuring that we are doing the right thing, which links directly into food safety culture, tying in the behaviours of the business and the individuals working for the business to ensure that food safety is part of their DNA, that they treat it just as important. And well, really, they treat it as food, not just as a commodity. Critically important. And when we're talking best practice, and certainly globally, I've been through lots of meat industry processes, the businesses that have a strong commitment to food safety from management, from the top leading down, and likewise link in those values and behaviours to their culture associated with food safety, they tend to have the best outcomes, absolutely the best outcomes. And tying it with that, meeting appropriate standards such as, it'd be remiss of me not to mention SQF, because I do work for SQF. So some references there that I've drawn on the information from. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time. I hope you've learned something, and my email address is there, so please feel free to contact me if you have any further questions. Thank you.